What if I told you that the war with Iran is not really about Iran? What if the missiles, the strikes, the coalition rhetoric about removing a dangerous regime, what if all of that is just the surface layer of something much bigger, something that is fundamentally about who controls the global economy for the next 50 years? Because when you start pulling at the threads, when you look at what happened in Venezuela just weeks before the Iran operation began, when you look at what China imports and what Russia needs on the battlefield in Ukraine, a very different picture starts to emerge. And that picture is not about security. It is about supremacy, economic supremacy. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see this conflict in a completely different way. Let me start by laying out something important. Every major military conflict in the modern era has a public reason and a strategic reason. The public reason is what governments put in front of cameras. It is usually some version of freedom, security, or stability. The strategic reason is what happens in the rooms where maps are spread across tables and analysts run scenario models on energy prices and trade flows. For Iran, the public reason is very straightforward. Washington has spent decades framing Iran as a destabilizing force in the Middle East, a regime that sponsors armed proxies across the region, funds militant groups, builds missiles, and consistently works to undermine American influence and allies throughout that part of the world. That framing is not invented. Iran genuinely has done those things. But the strategic reason goes somewhere much colder and much more consequential. Iran sits at the intersection of three pressure points that matter enormously in the contest between the United States and its two primary systemic rivals, China and Russia. First, Iran is one of China's most important energy suppliers, providing discounted crude oil that flows outside Western financial systems. Second, Iran has become a meaningful military-industrial partner to Russia, supplying drones, artillery shells, and ballistic missiles that have had direct operational impact in Ukraine. And third, Iran sits next to the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly 20% of global oil consumption and approximately 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade move every single year. That is not just geography. That is leverage. And leverage over Hormuz is leverage over global energy markets, which means leverage over every economy on Earth that depends on imported energy, which includes China, which includes most of Europe, which includes most of Asia. When you understand that, you start to understand why Iran is not just a hostile regime. Iran is a geo-economic node inside the largest strategic competition of our time. But here is where the preparation story gets really interesting, because Washington did not just wake up one morning and decide to escalate against Iran. There are strong signals that the United States spent time in the months before this conflict reducing its own vulnerability to the kind of energy shock that a major Middle East war typically produces. And the most important piece of evidence for that is what happened in Venezuela. On January 3rd, 2026, the United States conducted an operation in Venezuela. The details of that operation and its political dimensions are worth a separate video entirely. But for the purposes of this story, what matters is what happened to Venezuelan oil immediately after. Reuters reported that Venezuelan oil exports rebounded sharply in January, rising to around 800,000 barrels per day, up from roughly 498,000 barrels per day in December. Shipments to the United States specifically rose to about 284,000 barrels per day. And Reuters also reported that Washington reached a deal to redirect somewhere between 30 and 50 million barrels of Venezuelan crude away from China and toward the United States instead. Think about that for a moment. Before the Iran conflict began, the U.S. moved to pull Venezuelan barrels away from China and redirect them toward American refineries. Now, is Venezuelan oil going to replace Iranian oil in a full Hormuz disruption scenario? Absolutely not. The scale is completely different. Iranian oil exports, as we will get to in a moment, represent a huge share of Chinese imports. Venezuela cannot substitute for that. But that is not what this move was designed to do. This move was designed to improve the margin. More Western Hemisphere barrels flowing to Gulf Coast refiners. Slightly less dependence on flows that could be disrupted or that run through systems influenced by rivals. And when you combine that with where American domestic production stood entering 2026, the picture gets even more significant. The U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that American crude output averaged a record 13.61 million barrels per day in 2025, and near-term production was expected to stay near those record levels. The United States entered this conflict with more domestic energy cushion than it has had at virtually any point in modern history. So here is the central strategic thesis of this entire video, and I want you to really sit with this idea. The United States did not need to become immune to an energy shock from the Iran war. It only needed to become more resilient than China and more strategically flexible than Europe. That is a completely different standard. You do not need to be untouchable. You need to be better positioned than your rivals when the shock hits. And the combination of record domestic production, redirected Venezuelan barrels, and the option to release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve created exactly that kind of asymmetric resilience. Reuters reported in early March that the United States was already considering coordinated SPR sales as oil prices surged during the conflict. That is the playbook working in real time. Now let us talk about China, because this is where the economic stakes become enormous. In 2025, China bought more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil. Capillary data cited by Reuters put China's average purchases at approximately 1.38 million barrels per day from Iran over the course of the year. That represented roughly 13 to 14% of China's total seaborne crude imports. Reuters also reported that China was importing around 43 million barrels of Iranian oil per month. That is not a minor relationship. That is a structural dependency. And it goes beyond oil, because Iran is also one of China's significant trading partners more broadly. Iranian exports to China have been estimated at around $50 billion per year in recent years, with energy making up 60-70% of that figure, while Chinese exports to Iran have run into the billions annually as well. The key thing to understand about this relationship is not just the volume, it is the nature of the flow. Iranian oil moves to China at a discount outside Western financial systems in a way that helps Beijing reduce its exposure to the kind of leverage that the US dollar and US-aligned financial institutions can exert over normal international energy trade. For China, Iranian oil is not just cheap energy. It is energy that does not pass through choke points controlled by American allies, energy that is not priced or settled in ways that give Washington visibility or leverage. That is enormously valuable to a country that is actively trying to reduce its structural dependence on the Western-led financial order. If that channel gets disrupted, degraded, or formalized on less favorable terms, China loses barrels, and it loses a degree of strategic autonomy. Its import costs could rise, its bargaining position with Gulf producers could weaken, and its exposure to Western financial choke points increases. Russia's stake in Iran is different but equally significant. For Moscow, Iran is not primarily an energy supplier. Russia does not need Iranian oil. Russia is itself one of the world's largest oil producers. What Russia needs from Iran is military, industrial, and strategic. US, Ukrainian, and European officials have reported that Iran supplied Russia with thousands of drones and artillery shells for use in Ukraine. In 2024, Reuters reported that Iran had sent hundreds of ballistic missiles to Russia. And in 2025, reporting indicated that Iran was set to provide Russia with launchers for short-range ballistic missiles. This is not peripheral. Iranian weapons have given Russia cheap mass strike capacity on the battlefield in Ukraine, enabling a style of warfare that Russia could not sustain as easily with domestic production alone. That has real operational consequences for the conflict and for the cost Russia can impose on Ukraine and its Western backers. Beyond the battlefield, Russia and Iran have built a broader economic relationship under shared sanctions pressure. Trade between the two countries rose 16% to approximately $4.8 billion before an Eurasian Economic Union free trade deal with Iran took effect in May 2025. That agreement was designed to reduce tariffs and boost trade in agriculture, metals, and industrial goods. And Russia has been exporting significant quantities of grain to Iran, with reporting indicating Iran imported nearly 6 million tons of Russian grain between July and February of the relevant period, roughly double the pace of the year before. So this is a genuinely mutual relationship. Iran supports Russia militarily. Russia supports Iran with food security and industrial access. Degrade that relationship, and both sides pay a price. This brings us to the sharpest strategic point of this entire analysis. By striking Iran, the United States is not just striking Iran. It is applying simultaneous pressure to China's energy security and Russia's military supply chain through a single operation. That is extraordinarily efficient from a strategic standpoint. Against China, the mechanism is energy disruption and the potential loss of discounted sanctions-insulated crude. Against Russia, the mechanism is degraded access to Iranian weapon systems and the weakening of a key partner in the anti-Western alignment architecture. One conflict, two rivals, under pressure at the same time. Iran is not the final target in this framing. Iran is the pressure point through which Washington can test and weaken the broader coalition that has been forming against Western economic and political dominance. And if Washington were able to achieve something more than just degrading Iran's capabilities, if it were able to bring about a government in Tehran that was not actively aligned against Western interests, the geoeconomic consequences could be profound. Chinese access to sanctioned discount barrels could shrink dramatically or become restructured on far less favorable terms. Russian military access to Iranian systems could be cut off or significantly constrained. And the United States could gain influence over another major energy reserve base sitting right at the edge of Hormuz. That would represent a major redistribution of strategic leverage across Eurasia. Not the end of Chinese or Russian power, but a meaningful shift in the energy and trade geometry of the entire region. Now, I want to be honest with you here because this analysis would be incomplete without acknowledging the counterpoint. The Iran conflict has not been a clean win against Russia in the short term, and intellectually honest analysis requires saying that clearly. Reuters reported in early March that the war had fueled a significant bump in demand for Russian oil and gas. Higher global energy prices boost Russian hydrocarbon revenues. And on March 9th, Putin himself said publicly that the energy crisis had arrived and that Russia was ready to work with Europe, positioning Moscow as a potential beneficiary of the disruption. So the war has simultaneously weakened Iran as a Russian partner in the medium term, while temporarily enriching Russia through higher energy prices in the short term. That complexity matters. This is not a simple story where the United States plays a perfect chess move and wins instantly. It is a story of asymmetric pressures playing out over different time frames. Washington may be betting that the medium and long-term strategic gains outweigh the short-term boost to Russian revenues. So let me now bring this all together, because I want you to have a clear framework for understanding what you are watching unfold. The official narrative of the Iran conflict is about security. It is about degrading a dangerous regime, reducing regional instability, protecting allies. That narrative is not false, but it is incomplete. The deeper narrative is about economic power, about who controls energy flows, who controls sanctions architecture, who controls the financial rails through which global trade moves. The United States appears to have spent real time and effort improving its energy positioning before this conflict began. Record domestic production gave Washington a cushion. Redirected Venezuelan barrels improved the margin. SPR flexibility provided a tactical tool. That preparation was not accidental, and it was not coincidental with the timing of the Iran operation. Iran, meanwhile, was economically and strategically valuable to both of Washington's primary rivals. To China, it was a major discounted energy supplier outside Western systems. To Russia, it was a battlefield partner and sanctions-era ally. Neutralizing or fundamentally changing Iran's role in that triangle does not just affect the Middle East. It affects the balance of leverage across the entire Eurasian economic space. This is why you cannot understand this war by watching only the military dimension. The real battle is being fought in energy markets and trade routes and financial systems, in the architecture of who gets to impose costs on whom in the global economy. Iran is a node in that architecture, and whoever controls that node controls a piece of the map that determines economic supremacy for decades to come. Here is what I want you to take away from this video. Venezuela was not a random operation. It was preparation. Record American oil production was not just good economic news. It was strategic cover. The SPR is not just an emergency reserve. It is a geopolitical instrument. And Iran is not just a hostile regime being targeted for its behavior. It is a bridge, a connector, a linchpin between Chinese energy security and Russian military resilience. Remove that bridge, and the geometry of global power shifts. That is not speculation. That is what the trade data, the energy data, and the military supply chain reporting all point toward when you put them together in the same frame. This war may look regional when you zoom in, but when you zoom out, when you look at the energy flows and the trade relationships and the sanctions architecture and the dollar system and the strategic positioning of the world's three largest powers, what you see is a conflict that is fundamentally about the shape of the global economy for the next generation. And that is exactly why it matters. Not just to people in the Middle East, not just to policymakers in Washington or Beijing or Moscow, but to everyone on Earth who participates in an economy that runs on energy, that trades across borders, and that is affected by who gets to write the rules of global commerce. The battlefield is everywhere, and the war for supremacy is already underway. If you found this analysis valuable, I want to know what you think. Do you buy the thesis that Venezuela was deliberate economic preparation? Do you think Washington has actually improved its position relative to China and Russia? Or is this a much more dangerous gamble than the strategic framing suggests? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to go deeper on the geoeconomics of what is happening right now, I have more videos coming that will continue pulling at these threads. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss them, because the next chapter of this story is going to be just as consequential as the one we just walked through together.